When businesses face dramatic change, leaders need the data and insights to act with confidence. Mergers and acquisitions, public offerings, and business transformations always come with finance and accounting challenges. But today, the stakes are even higher as finance automation accelerates. Competitors are looking for new advantages. As ESG moves to the forefront, stakeholders expect new metrics for success. Staying ahead requires the latest technology and the right experience. The KPMG Data and Analytics Platform offers integrated solutions helping accounting and finance leaders reach decisions and act with speed and clarity. It's powered by nearly 3,000 analytics professionals. Data from 3,300 proprietary and third-party sources, AI and machine learning capabilities, and a leading network of alliances. Together, that provides insights to address critical situations, including deal valuations, financial reporting, and functional transformation. Our platform supports a wide range of analytical methods, third-party applications, and custom-built solutions, enabling insights for recurring revenue, customer retention, ESG benchmarks, financial reporting, sensitivity analysis, organizational design, and much more. KPMG is well equipped to help you and your company along every step of the way to maximize value and create sustained performance. To learn more about how KPMG Data and Analytics can support your company, visit the KPMG Business Transformation Insights page. The finance and accounting landscape faces dramatic change, but with the right insights, opportunity is everywhere.
All right, so in addition to data and analytics, obviously a topic that came up really frequently in our recent CAO survey was cybersecurity. I'm sure it won't surprise anyone in here to know that 2/3 of CAOs are currently applying or plan to apply a risk management program to enhance their cybersecurity, and that 37% are currently in collaboration with the CISO on finance and accounting cyber matters, and that over half expect to increase that amount of collaboration in the next 2 to 5 years. I'm sure you've all seen internally and externally the news on cyber that the threats are not waning. They will only be increasing over the next few years, and you're probably spending more and more time on it in your organizations. So here to discuss risk controls and mitigation in cyber, privacy, and ransomware, please welcome Jonathan Fairtlow. Thank you.
Morning, folks. First, I would like to introduce my esteemed panelists who are accompanying me here today. We've got Derek Garagos, who is, well, I'll let them each provide their title and background themselves, but he is Executive Vice President with Hub, and my very good friend Mauricio Paez, who we've worked together for many years, partner with Jones Day, both of whom extensively focus on cyber and risk issues in their respective practice areas. But I thought I would start first by pointing out a little bit about why we're here. I mean, this isn't a conference for CISOs, right? This isn't a technical one where there's going to be a detailed review of ways to configure your firewall or things to instruct your computer systems with in order to engage in protection, right? Well, the reason why we're here and why we're bringing this discussion in the form that we are here today is because we believe that the changing environment, both regulatory, risk-wise, and the nature and scope of the risk that cyber threats pose to your business are increasingly requiring CIOs, CFOs, and the financial part of the business to get actively involved in both understanding the risk involved with cyber, effectively modeling it, and perhaps most importantly, ensuring that that risk is getting effectively communicated to the board so that decisions can be made to effectively mitigate or understand that risk. So part of the goal here today is to really help you understand both where these risks are coming from, what's currently changing within the landscape that we are seeing, and where you are very likely to be brought into discussions or focus areas around this. Again, we're not going to talk about bits, bytes. There's not going to be a discussion about threat vectors or anything technical. Instead, what I want you to really take from this particular discussion is this is an opportunity for you to hear and to ask any questions you have around how your role as CAO, CFO, or significant financial advisor is going to need to be implementing cyber risk controls in your environment. So with that, let me pass it over to David to provide a quick introduction and to talk a little bit about what he sees currently in the market.
Sure, happy to. So my name is Dave Garrigus. I lead Hub International's ProX practice, which includes professional liability, executive liability, transactional risk, and the topic here today, cyber risk. This is an area that has evolved quite significantly over the last couple of years. I'm sure many of you, if you are involved in the purchase of cyber insurance, have seen very significant changes that manifest both in rate, in terms and conditions, and in deductible levels. And so look forward to spending some time today sharing some insights on that market.
And let me pass it over to Mauricio to talk a little bit about what you're seeing both on the legal side and some of the regulatory risks.
Thanks, Jonathan. I appreciate it, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very excited to be here. Yeah, my name is Mauricio Payas. I'm a partner in the New York office for Jones Day. I'm one of the firm's founders in our cybersecurity practice worldwide. And I had the opportunity to really look at how cybersecurity risk and liability issues, legal issues, regulatory issues have evolved over the many years. And I would say that today, there's a sea change, in particular around enterprise risk management when it comes to cyber for registered entities. And we're going to see that in 2023. I want to talk a little bit about how that came to be, how that role has evolved in terms of reporting, risk management, the role of managing that risk away from just the technology side over to executive management on the board level, and what does that mean for organizations moving forward for 2023? And taking into consideration that it is fueled by regulatory changes, in many ways, particularly for multinationals, conflicting regulatory obligations that arise, and a lowering of the period in which you have to make a number of notifications and reports when it comes to cybersecurity incidents, and including cybersecurity risk management. And so I'm looking forward to that discussion.
Thanks, Mauricio. And part of the reason why I'm here is I am a principal with KPMG's cyber threat management practice. I'm the person who shows up when it all goes really wrong. My job is both as incident responder to help companies both investigate, respond to, and mitigate the issues that occurred during a breach. And a large part of my particular function is to help a company manage that cyber issue while also communicating to executives and communicate to the board around how that risk is going to play out and some of the long-term issues with it. So again, I very much hope that I get a chance to work with all of you on the proactive side and that you have absolutely no need for my incident response Sunday evening services. And so with that, what I wanted to do is to pose the first question to the group. Given what we are currently seeing in this market and the sea change that has happened just in the past 6 months, what do you consider to be the most significant risks that are currently impacting how a company should evaluate cyber risk going forward? And I'll start with David.
Sure. So it's interesting, right? Because I think for many of you, again, who've been involved in the purchase of cyber insurance, the big event, the big trigger for the change in the market was the rise of ransomware, what we often refer to as the ransomware epidemic, which is still impacting organizations. But I think as important as what the cause was is everything that you can do now to be aware of the issues that underwriters are using now to evaluate organizations. I'm a recovered underwriter myself. I used to lead the cyber underwriting group at an insurance carrier. What I would tell you is that if you were to ask any of my former peers, prior to the ransomware epidemic, what is the way that you evaluate cyber risk? What is your secret sauce? How is it that you're going to make money in this business? They all would have said to a person, we have the smartest people. We know how to pour through these applications and these assessments, and we know how to pick the organizations that aren't going to have claims. And then ransomware hits, and they realized that they were all terrible underwriters of cyber risk, right? They all got completely torched. And so now that same group of underwriting leaders has to answer not just how are you going to make money, but how are you not going to sustain losses like we just experienced? And so they've had to pivot. They can't say that we have the smartest underwriters in the room. They can tear through applications. They can't say that anymore. So what they've done is they've switched. I mean, remember, the insurance industry can at times not be terribly creative. They said, okay, we don't have the smartest people in the room, but these organizations over here, they do. And by that I mean the outside-in assessments or scans, such as BitSight or Security Scorecard or Guidewire, they have pivoted as an industry to using these outside-in assessments of risk or scans, either proprietary with certain insurtechs like Coalition, or most commonly BitSight is used. They've used that as the basis of their underwriting, a large part of their underwriting. So knowing that, there's a lot that can be done to understand how underwriters perceive your risk and to be very proactive in the process. And we've seen that lead to significantly better outcomes. So if you go ahead and run a scan and you understand how you rate overall, what are the areas of potential concerns to underwriters, then you can correct misperceptions, because with any outside-in scan, there are going to be issues with the quality of the data. And you can also message around compensating controls or other areas where we've got a story to tell. And by doing so, we often find that underwriters who tend to take the easy path and just decline something that doesn't fully fit the box, all of a sudden you've given them all of the ammunition they need to get creative and to get aggressive. And competition generally leads to better outcomes. And so it's been a real change since ransomware in how underwriters are evaluating risk and how underwriters are choosing the companies that they're providing cyber insurance to and the degree to which they provide coverage.
So to kind of take that topic and move it to, let's talk a little bit about what has changed in the regulatory environment that might be both driving a little bit of the insurance discussion and also some of the approaches that can benefit you both on the regulatory side and on the insurance side. Rishi, you want to touch a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think I'll start with first what was the precursors to that change in regulatory environment. Certainly not just ransomware and the scourge of ransomware, but the rise of extortion beyond ransomware. So exfil, we're going to disclose all this stuff, pay us, or you're going to have some embarrassing information published in the dark web, and we're going to disseminate it everywhere. And that's going to have an immediate impact on the business, relationships, brand value, so on and so on. And so what we saw is that from the regulatory perspective, there's a view that organizations, particularly registered organizations, are not properly disclosing how they are assessing, defining, measuring, and reporting on those risks. It's unique to cyber. Why? Well, obviously, 2018, 2019 saw a very noticeable increase in digitization across enterprises. 2020 changed it and blew it to 300%, right? It just went through the roof. Everyone was adopting, they needed the virtualization, upgrade a lot of systems, and there was a lot of liberalization around some of these controls. They had to be, right, because of the nature of COVID. And what the regulators are looking at, in particular in the US with respect to the SEC, is looking at it and they're saying, well, the investor community really needs to understand how organizations are actually defining that risk. What is the cyber risk appetite of the organization? How are they making the right investments? And how do they measure and report on that risk? And so the regulatory change in this sort of trend of more disclosure, more notifications, is to rise it even higher and now require changes in 8Ks and 10Ks through Regulation HQ to really provide some very specific obligations on reporting incidents. But they didn't stop there. What we see as proposals now for regulations for next year is really enhance the disclosure in 10Ks of how the organization actually is assessing and managing that risk. How is executive management and the board in particular being informed of that risk? Where are the appropriate resources being allocated to manage those risks properly? And how is how effective is going to be the organization in investigating? What are the pre-incident methods and approaches that they're deploying in order to effectively manage an incident? And that's all now going to be reported in filings, in the registrations. So I think that is, in addition to this very complicated set of rules and regulations, depending on the industry and the nature of the data and the incidents, where you do have notification obligations, we're supposed to notify affected individuals and the regulators of these incidents. We're seeing that, particularly with respect to registered entities, a greater focus. Now, there's a lot of issues in these proposed regulations, and there's going to be a lot of debate where, what's appropriate. How do you define a cybersecurity incident? What are the mechanics of assessing the risk associated with an incident? What is the appropriate reporting associated with that incident? What is the triggers of notification with respect to materiality? Obligations around expertise within the board on some cyber literacy, or at least some understanding of cyber risks. And what does that really mean for purposes of the business judgment rule, and whether is it appropriate and necessary? So there's a lot of debate that we're going to continue to see. Unfortunately, though, the comment period has just ended. And so what we're going to see now is an assessment of the comments and the regulations. But our sense is that we're going to see a new set of regulations modifying Regulation SK and also modifying the Financial Advisors Act and with respect to broker-dealers and financial advisors, those sort of set of regulatory frameworks to enhance reporting. And so what that means that organizations are going to have to look at assessing risk very early on, understanding what's going to go into that reporting, what's going to go into those disclosures. And I would say that one of the biggest challenges that I have seen is really providing a more integrated approach to how you're going to manage not just incident pre-breach management of that risk, but how do you engage the right stakeholders to inform very quickly now in a very rapid pace what that means to the organization.
So let's touch a little bit on that issue exactly. Frankly, folks, gone are the days that you can send the insurance questionnaire over to the CISO and a couple other people to fill out some of the technical requirements. Gone are the days that this issue is one for the technical teams to build out. Because of the change in the regulatory environment, and perhaps most importantly, because the focus of the regulation is going to be understanding how you have identified and managed your risk, you need to think of this as a part of a regular, ongoing assessment. And in most enterprises that we have seen start to really focus on this, that focus is becoming part of the internal audit function. Because again, assessing, identifying the controls, identifying the risk parameters, ensuring that they're being properly met is going to be critical to being able to effectively respond to the regulatory requirements should you have an incident. And here's two things to kind of think about. In the old way, you were able to kind of figure this out as you go. You had a breach, you put together your incident response team, you focused on fixing the issue. But now, with the requirements of these new regulations, which frankly have very much a books and records feel, you can be already in violation simply by not having done some of the groundwork, by not having prepared the appropriate plans, by not showing your homework and how you're documenting and approaching risk. And so what we see is that these sort of issues are going to start to come more and more to your doors because of your role and function around audit and being able to identify control levels. So let's talk a little bit about this changing regulatory framework. Do you see any changes with the cyber insurance market as a result of it?
Very much so. So in addition to some of the changes I noted earlier with how underwriters are evaluating risk, with the impact on pricing and on retention or deductible levels, I think one of the most important changes that unfortunately doesn't get enough airtime is the change in coverage that we're seeing in many of these policies. Because how those incidents are covered within the insurance policy can vary quite significantly. And the only thing worse than spending as much money as we're all spending now on cyber insurance is then to not have those policies actually perform in the event you have a claim. And I would tell you that I'd be happy to visit with anyone on specific examples, but we saw during the hardening of the market, some organizations, I would say rather without as much context or disclosure as probably would be reasonable, make very significant reductions to coverage in exchange for an easy use during the hardening of the market that I think, well, it has already burned a number of organizations. And so you've got to be very cautious. Looking forward, there are some other changes on the horizon that are quite problematic that we're tracking very closely. So a couple of great examples. In the London market right now, we've seen variations of war and terrorism exclusions added to cyber insurance policies. Now, there are 4 prevailing versions of that exclusionary wording with pretty significant consequences to which version is chosen as to how the policies will respond to actions that we all experience every day, including actions that may be either directly or indirectly linked to a state actor. Another example is one of the leading cyber insurers in the world has announced that beginning next year, they're going to put significant limitations on cyber insurance policies relating to issues that they deem systemic. Right? And I want to emphasize they deem, because there's not a clear definition. Right? And by significant limitations, it includes cutting the limit by 50% if they deem the risk to be a systemic risk to their clients and to their customer base. That's huge. That's an enormous limitation on coverage from one of the leading cyber insurance companies in the world. Right? So it's changes like that that can severely impact whether or not coverage applies in these policies.
And again, to kind of pass this over to Mauricio, given this sea change in the regulatory framework, what pre-incident steps do the C-suite and the GC really need to be considering?
Yeah, now and what Dave just said about the changing landscape in the coverage side, right, for cyber, because it means that you have to find all the ways to mitigate and manage those risks, where you may have gaps or you may have these issues. And that means that the first and foremost, and what we're now seeing reflected in these proposed regulations, is really elevating cyber as part of ERM, really looking at cyber risk across the entire enterprise. And not just within enterprise, but all the extended sort of relationships that you have with business partners and the high reliance on service providers and third-party enablers of the business. And it's not just going into the sort of, like you mentioned earlier, the financial reporting systems, is the operational systems, is the product systems, is cyber risk on revenue-driving products that are all connected and digitally enabled. And so I'll start from the sort of the board level, is really understanding what the executive management and the enterprise sees as the cyber risks, getting the appropriate framework for measuring that risk and getting that reporting in place, because that's going to be key, particularly with the ransomware, where we see an increased decision upon the board as to whether to pay or not pay a ransom. You imagine if you're asking your board, should we pay this ransom or not, putting aside insurance coverage. And that's a very important decision to be made with respect to the issues associated with engaging in that conduct. And so we see a real need, certainly at the board level, to have that cyber literacy, to understand their role, to make sure that how much information and at what point do they need to receive in order to exercise sound business judgment, a reasonable business judgment when it comes to allocation of resources, obviously coverage, where investments need to be made, and how is the organization across the entire enterprise managing these risks as they evolve over time. And of course, that means empowering executive management, making the right investments in areas of mitigation, detection, and response. And oftentimes, I find that increasingly, we're seeing that there is a need to really extend the testing of these sort of capabilities, of these controls and these approaches, with the involvement of not just executive management, but at some appropriate level, the board as well, because they're going to be involved, certainly in some of these massive events that we have been seeing. And so I think, to me, that's important, that the change in regulatory framework, the ability to offload and shift risk to insurance, and the set of expectations and complexity, not just in terms of operational implications, supply chain issues, issues that may affect revenue, but also liability and claims. Of course, we all know that when you have a massive breach, you can count on a few things, and one of them is going to be your regulator wants to understand what happened. You're going to have a plaintiff's bar knocking at your door. You're going to have probably a need to make a very comprehensive internal investigation in a very complex environment. And so preparing yourself for all of that at the executive management and at the board level is of, I think, critical importance for the future.
So one quick comment. As we start to provide this level of detail, most people usually feel one of two things: either an overwhelming desire to just run away, or a "this isn't my issue" feeling. Let me assure you that this is very manageable. The critical thing is identifying and developing a framework by which you are going to assess your risk so you can understand and quantify it. One of the things that we've provided for you in the app is an outline of some of the different frameworks and some of the approaches that you can look for that to work through here. I really have to stress that once you've done that assessment, once you understand where you're generating revenue from your cyber assets, what you're keeping in terms of data, and how and where you're keeping it, you get a better picture about the risk and your exposure, and you can make decisions that start to manage that effectively. That assessment, that understanding is the critical piece, because that allows you to build all of your frameworks going forward. Now, there are many different types and approaches to an assessment, but you need to consider this as being something that you're going to start, build, and continue to do over the life cycle of the business. Because if you don't know what data you have, you don't know who's keeping it, and most importantly, you don't know how or why that data is generating revenue or providing a benefit for the company, you can't make decisions that are risk-based around where it should be stored, who should keep it, and who should have access.
Yeah, Jonathan, I just want to add that the proposed changes to Reg SK on the disclosure in your 10K is going to be a component of how you are measuring and responding to the cyber risk of the organization. So all the steps that you're mentioning are going to be prerequisites to understanding that in order to be able to make that kind of disclosure.
And they can also be very helpful with your broker in helping understand how to price and where your risk might be actually better placed. So let's shift a little bit, okay? So let's assume that everyone here has put together a good approach towards a cyber incident, and let's also assume that everyone here suffers a cyber incident. Now, there's many different variants, many different types, but what I always like to kind of focus on is, okay, there's a breach. You hear about it in an executive meeting that there's an issue with data. What immediate steps are necessary from you? Who should be informed and when? What is the escalation path to get information to the board or to certain regulators? And again, part of what I'll ask this group here, when you have an IR plan in place, what are the things that usually trip up companies? And I'll start first to kind of get the insurance perspective on how brokers and carriers may or may not be properly informed and the impact that that can have.
Sure, absolutely. So first of all, both the broker and the carrier should be very involved in an incident. From a broker perspective, we employ insurance coverage attorneys. They help from the time that we're first noticed of a matter in who is selected to provide support to the customer throughout the process, in managing questions around rate, in making sure that we're complying with the terms and conditions of the policy to ensure that coverage applies to the greatest extent possible. Now, from a carrier perspective, there are degrees to which they are involved. Some carriers are very prescriptive in terms of which vendors are selected. Often there are some benefits in the form of more favorable rates. Other carriers take a much more hands-off approach. But the key is, throughout the process, making sure that we are engaging service providers in the right way, and that we are managing the process in such a way to maximize the recovery under the policy.
And what can happen when folks don't initiate that and later seek to come back and trigger payment for services that may not be properly covered or may not be appropriately segregated?
It's very challenging at that point. Most of the insurance policies have time-sensitive loss notice requirements. They have, in certain cases, requirements that the insurance company pre-approve the use of a particular vendor or for counsel. And in many cases, they may even mandate that the service provider come from a panel of approved firms. Now, the best thing that we can do collectively to avoid some of those issues is to have those discussions ahead of time. At the time you're negotiating the insurance policy, make sure that the vendors that you want to use are incorporated into the insurance policy or included within their panel. And that can eliminate a lot of stress and question at a a very stressful period.
Let me, Jonathan, emphasize that point, because I think everyone deserves their counsel of choice. And you may not have your counsel or your breach response firm or your forensics firm that you already have used and enjoy or that are appropriate to know your business, know your footprint, understands your infrastructure. So I just want to emphasize that it's important to, when you go through the renewals or you're negotiating a new policy, to include those third parties that are going to support. And why is that important? Because one of the things that happens that I see still problematic is not enough organizations, including the largest organizations, have not done that pre-breach work of getting those folks involved and engaged and having those arrangements already in place. You don't want, and when you're in crisis mode, the last thing you want to do certainly is have to negotiate with your carrier to include someone that you really want to use as an approved third-party provider. An incident. And number two, you don't want to have to be negotiating these terms, particularly when it comes to some of these big high-impact incidents like ransomware. You want to try to negotiate a retainer for payment facilitation, a digital wallet. That all takes time. And if you're talking about the new reporting obligations, where you may have to report in 48 hours, 72 hours, depending on how you define the triggers, that's a real issue. And so addressing that issue up front with your carrier on making sure that your counsel and your other providers are approved, in my experience has been that, there's some exceptions, but for the most part, most carriers will approve your counsel and your providers of choice during the process of renewal or as an endorsement. But you'll have to bring that up.
What I think is really critical here, folks, is part of what we're talking or really messaging is we feel that some of the responsibilities you currently have within your corporation are going to really make you a focal point for ensuring that this process continues to be worked through. So for example, you spend time building out and putting in place a proper assessment. It's probably wise to have that initial assessment done under privilege so that whatever is found gets some level of protection while you try and address it. But that also means that that firm you've worked with, both the investigative firm that's helping you understand the risk and the legal firm that's helping you guide it, then become very knowledgeable of how you work, what you have, what the structure is. So when you have an issue and there needs to be an 8K filing really, really quickly, that language, that structure comes from a knowledge source as opposed to something that is built in a 2 to 3 hour, very stressful meeting that I've seen many boards have to go through, that then becomes something you live with for the rest of that particular incident. Mm-hmm. One other thing I also want to stress here is don't overlook in an incident the value and requirement of having management for the incident. And I'm not talking about someone who does the response or someone who manages the communications. I'm talking about the day-to-day operation of an incident. Most companies find this to be a significant interruption, and there tends to be two sets of costs. You have a lot of different vendors, a lot of different people. You have these large calls with high billing going on those calls, and you often have a lot of senior staff taking anywhere from half to 2/3 of their time managing or trying to understand the incident. Putting in place and planning for that, doing both some prep and putting in place incident management can really help drastically reduce that and allow the folks who need to be on those calls selected, but also ensure that there's ways for senior management to get appropriate information so that it's being managed and can be appropriately overseen without having to be on every call and gathering every detail. So there's a lot of structure and planning here that can significantly benefit how an incident turns out and what the long-term benefit or issues for the companies that flow from it. So, clicker's stuck here a bit, okay? So, I think everyone here has probably done a tabletop or had some other incident that they've participated in where they've walked through issues of a cyber breach. And those always tend to end with a little bit of a darkened end. There's a lawsuit pending or other things like that. But what a lot of companies don't really think about is that there actually is a significant tail to most cyber incidents. So let's talk a little bit about what a company can do to effectively manage the aftermath. And what are the lingering issues that, if not addressed, can lead to either ongoing risk or potentially renewed cyber attack? So first up, how does a carrier evaluate you after you've had a big breach?
Well, so the carrier will look at a couple of things. Number one, as I mentioned earlier, they will utilize an outside scan to look at potential vulnerabilities, and they may be more, they may ask more questions around what you're doing to resolve perceived issues. But additionally, we need to provide context on what occurred, and in particular as well, what steps have been taken by the organization to lessen the likelihood of a future event. I mean, that really becomes a critical conversation with underwriters after a breach has occurred. Now, I also want to note how we see organizations respond to a breach, aside from implementing changes in controls, because typically the breach is the catalyst for an organization to say, are we buying enough? What is the right limit for us? We've just had an issue. The limits under the insurance policy may or may not have been enough to cover the cost of the breach, but that's the point at which they're asking, how do we evaluate limit adequacy in our organization for this line of coverage? And it's interesting, because if you look at the evolution of how organizations have looked at limits, pre-ransomware, right, it was typically a very simplistic calculator. You looked at average costs to notify impacted parties because it was a disclosure of confidential information. You looked at credit monitoring costs. You looked at some regulatory compliance costs, right? And you added all of that together across however many records that organization held, and that was the basis of limits. But then ransomware hits. Well, that model really doesn't work for ransomware. And so organizations now have moved, unfortunately, to a large degree to benchmarking. Well, what is benchmarking, right? Benchmarking is a comparison against other similar organizations. But there are a couple of underlying presumptions in that are really dangerous, right? The first is that you can actually define a peer group, because you can have two organizations of similar size, even within the same industry, who have wildly different profiles and exposures. But even if you can get to a good peer group, right, there's the underlying presumption that what they're doing is correct and should be the basis of what you're doing. And we know that many organizations, most organizations, aren't doing a great job of valuing their cyber risk, right? And so I would suggest that benchmarking is a really ineffective way of organizations determining limit adequacy. Now, what we and a few other organizations have moved to is stochastic modeling, right? We look at actual organization-specific characteristics. We overlay that on real costs associated with real issues, and we can predict costs at different confidence levels. We believe that is a better way of assessing limit adequacy, and it can be impacted by a recent event, and this tends to come up if it hasn't ahead of time, and hopefully it has, right? Hopefully all of you have gone through this type of analysis, but if you haven't, often it's post-breach when this comes up.
You should be starting to see a little trend here, folks, that if you've assessed and modeled your risk, you're going to be able to effectively respond to regulators. You're going to have tighter controls and less cost for an incident. And even after an incident, you're going to have something to go back to in order to evaluate against and to help refine the risk model based upon the experience. Now, how does this play out long term? What is the litigation or regulatory timeline after a major incident?
Yeah, it's such a lawyer action, a lawyer response, but it depends, right? But I would say one thing is that, from the starting point is that the drivers of regulatory issues or potential litigation, I find is ineffective risk management at the point of pre-incident and during the initial stages of the incident. Mishandling, not understanding that in fact when you're putting a disclosure or you're making a reporting, that could be Exhibit A on the litigation that gets filed almost immediately. And of course, with the benefit of hindsight, you should have done this, you could have done that, you should have invested here, you should have had more controls, you should have not engaged this third party to do this, right? And so what you get is, depending on the incident and the regulatory obligations when it comes to reporting, that you may have a litigation filed almost immediately. You may have a regulatory inquiry coming to you immediately, again, particularly if you're in a regulated space. But some cases you will find that litigation tails a little further out, particularly around consumer litigation, because they have to actually plead their case and make a finding that will survive early stages where litigations can get kicked out of court. And so what you find is that it really varies tremendously, but one of the sort of indicators for me is ineffective pre-breach planning and ineffective response to that, where you're actually maybe enabling exacting litigation. You may be actually facilitating litigation because you haven't engaged the right sort of resources. Certainly, not to plug myself too much, but certainly you want competent cyber legal counsel, not just reporting or SEC regulatory counsel. You want cyber counsel that really understands how the investigation can be handled, what kind of communications you're bringing out, how do you creating artifacts and evidence, and do it with the perspective that there are regulatory issues, there are potential liability issues, but there also are operational issues, there are brand issues. And the one thing that I think you will find, and one of the things that are being sort of highlighted as the need for this new regulatory framework for next year on this sort of reporting, is that there's been underreporting. That even when there is a breach, that there is insufficient reporting of the incident, what the impact of that incident is, a proper characterization of the materiality of that incident. And in some cases, we've seen litigation coming after the reporting, because the claims are that there was insufficient reporting, that the board wasn't properly informed, that a host of different sort of claims that are used in order to create sort of exposure and liability. And I think that effective response and understanding that some of these things that you're doing and that you're responding to and the steps you're taking would be tested, they would be questioned, and maintaining privilege, maintaining confidentiality is important, in some cases very critical, but that's not the only thing you need to be doing when it comes to why you want to engage competency. Now, I will say one thing in addition to that, and that is, increasingly we see the Department of Justice going after organizations that are doing government procurement, that are doing government payments, and they're going after them for false claims with respect to representations around cyber risk management, cyber protection, breach response, and we're seeing a very disturbing trend where they're very serious about going after, including protection of whistleblowers and payouts in some cases very recently, because the company has made all these representations of compliance and controls and security, and DOJ is obviously taking the view that those were misrepresentations that were misleading the government. And how do they review it? How do they test it? Ordinarily, because there's been an incident, and the incident wasn't handled properly. And then now the argument is you did not have effective controls, you did not have appropriate risk management, and so on and so forth, and then you result in potential risk. So this is, the prospects of investigations and litigation sometimes can be immediate, and sometimes it can take a long time. But what is the sort of the common denominator is you can actually manage those two if you're very effective when it comes to planning and immediate breach response.
One other thought. Most of the systems that you use on a day-to-day basis to produce the financial results that go to your external auditor, I can guarantee you, if you have an incident, you will need to show how those systems were not impacted. You're going to need to prove a negative. So it's very important that you also understand the controls and in particular the verbosity of the logs around SOC systems. Otherwise, you can actually have an investigation within an investigation, separate with privilege, just to be able to identify and answer questions that your external auditor will be looking at in order to ensure that they can rely on the validity of the information within your books. Mm-hmm. So there is, however, one small but very important silver lining to most incidents. It is a world-class opportunity to finally address tech debt. One of the reasons why so many breaches occur to large organizations is because they have a complex technical environment. Everyone is hybrid with a little cloud and a little on-prem, and they have multiple systems that are not updated or structured for future capability. When you have a breach, you, in many cases, are forced to address those issues in order to respond to a regulator, in order to address and show that you're moving forward, or to be able to secure favorable coverage. So there's actually a little bit of an opportunity in a breach to finally get some consensus and to drive movement to change tech debt issues. However, it's far better if you use the assessment to identify that and to start appropriately funding, managing, and building towards it, because it's going to be a lot more chaotic, and frankly, a lot more expensive if you have to do this in response to an incident as a remediation action rather than an uplift action. Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit now about some of the ways that you can stay connected with this information. We've talked about this really critical part of making sure that you're appropriately assessing, understanding the regulatory environment, and getting detailed information back that you can use to fill out the risk register and to appropriately cost your risk. But this is going to change. What we talk about here would have been slightly different just 4 months ago. There's constant updates in this environment. So what are some of the ways that executive teams can stay informed of the external cyber threat environment, the current versions of ransomware, and the new threats that come about?
Well, I would say that, as you mentioned, it's an ever-evolving issue, and you can't expect to do all the analysis yourselves. Make use of key trading partners, of key vendors who send out regular updates, white papers and the like on the evolving threat landscape. But if there's one thing I could really leave everyone with today, it's be proactive, right? And that manifests in how you understand the evolving environment, but it's be proactive with understanding how others are evaluating or viewing your cyber risk, and do that by running and understanding external scans. Be proactive with how you adapt policy wording to enable you to use certain vendors. Be proactive with how you value your cyber risk, right? Go through stochastic modeling, understand what those costs may look like in the event you have an issue, and of course, be proactive with making sure that the insurance policy wording evolves as that environment changes and as we see new issues arise.
Right. Mauricio, are you seeing boards and executive teams start to actually participate in cyber, like simulations?
Yeah, not just simulations, but even more broadly. I mean, I want to underscore what Dave said. Being proactive isn't just the appropriate way of identifying, quantifying, or measuring, and being able to effectively fashion your response to managing that risk. It's also going to be, it is in many ways a regulatory obligation already. And increasingly it's going to be now a reporting obligation to demonstrate how proactive you're being. And so that's why we're seeing a lot more engagement and involvement, not just by executive management, but also by the board. Yeah, the days of just it being an IT issue, they've been gone. I mean, they've been gone a long time ago. But what I see the issue is really is around the framework. What is the appropriate framework for all the component parts of risk management when it comes to cybersecurity? And one of the two areas that I want to sort of, as takeaways note is, one, we still don't see enough emphasis on the insider threat. That's evolved significantly over time. And insider threat isn't just, how do we sort of identify a problem? Today, still we're seeing the issue identified after the threat manifests. The obligation is to actually put in place processes, controls, assessments that allow you to have that visibility of the evolving insider threat before they manifest. And so I think one of the challenges we're seeing is that executive management aren't putting enough attention to how to actually develop their approach to insider threat management, which is different than outside third-party threat actors, criminal syndicates, those individuals. So that's one area. And the other is, unfortunately, we're still seeing a lot of not just major events stemming from third-party providers or key business partners, for which, as you mentioned, there's a lot of high dependency on, but not integrating those third-party providers in your enterprise risk management in terms of incident planning, reporting. Imagine if you have a major event, you have a very significant cloud service provider, and you cannot get access to logs without significant negotiation. You can't get information because they're worried about their exposure. Or there may be a subcontractor in a government contract, so they may see direct liability as well. So these things, if you plan them right and you're addressing those properly with a very defined, thought-out, enterprise-wide insider threat management program, in terms of cyber risk, and a third-party cyber risk program that interfaces along with the organization properly, not only is it going to help you effectively manage those risks as they continue to evolve over time, but also, I assume, Dave, it help you with just understanding exactly where the areas of coverage, because when it comes to third parties, coverage differs a little bit. And I'll be interested to hear a little bit about that from Dave as well.
So just to quickly touch on two things that Mauricio brought up. When we talk about insider threat, we're not just talking about a disgruntled employee. Part of what we are now seeing is because of some of the great new tools that your CISO has pushed you to buy, like EDR tools, let's say you've got a broad-scale deployment of multi-factor authentication. As an attacker, my ability to either talk my way in or my ability to break my way in has become more limited. So now I need an insider. Just think of the amount of external resources who have access to your network that, if not being properly monitored or checked for, can be a low-wage, high-opportunity environment for an attack group to basically buy intelligence. You know, for $1,000, why don't you turn your IT creds over to me for a night? This happens on a regular basis. We're also seeing technologies like SIM swaps being used to take over phones in order to take care of or get past multi-factor authentication. So the risk of insider threat can undermine a really good program set. Yet, I think this is something that most people don't know. For example, your Microsoft Office suite now has some tooling built in to help identify inappropriate insider activity. But it has to be turned on, it has to be configured, and it has to be structured as part of a plan. The second thing I wanted to quickly touch on is this concept of a simulation. And there's a lot of phrases out there that just drive me crazy. I'm sure you've all heard pen test, and you've all heard tabletop, and you've probably heard a red team. What's the difference between all of those? A pen test is where you're specifically using and evaluating one particular item to see if it's susceptible to breach. It's targeted to that one tool, that one process, that one system. Now, you can do it broadly, but all that it does is it tells you where you have opened doors or windows. A red team exercise is where the attacker then attempts to get in, where they attempt to exploit the door, to take the vulnerability and make it real. And red teams are very useful in showing how bad things can be, but they often tend to have a significant negative impact on your own IT teams. Because in many cases, the red team data is reported to them in a way where it shows up their shortcomings. They already have a difficult job. They're already well aware of the things that they're missing. It functions in a way that, without an additional focus, can actually hurt if there's not follow-up activity with it. And a tabletop, well, that's an exercise done usually via PowerPoint that walks an executive team through a scenario. One of the more interesting approaches for taking this testing concept is a concept called a purple team. Yeah, I know, I don't make up the colors, but purple team it is. It's a red team exercise done collaboratively with the actual IT team. So they get to see the attack unfold, respond, and they get critique. It becomes a learning exercise that they run through that models in your environment with a known risk. And in many cases, internal audit observes. It becomes a great way to see how controls and processes actually work, rather than trying to interview off something that might not give you the sort of technical depth or risk richness that you need. And then that flows into an active tabletop exercise for the executive team. There are lots of ways to really help model and work this, and it's a critical part of what you're going to need to do going forward. Well, folks, we've talked for about almost 50 minutes now, so I'd like to give opportunities for any questions, any areas that you'd like us to follow up on or go into greater detail.
Yeah, just a quick question. Are you seeing that there's any typical cybersecurity risks or organizational vulnerabilities that are commonplace across organizations that maybe CAOs or CFOs don't have front of mind that they can walk away with today?
I'll pass it to Mauricio first, and then I'll follow.
Yeah, so we talked about ransomware generally, but the real move is around extortion. And so it's really understanding whether everything has been done properly to assess exfiltration of data. And the other thing I would sort of mention is that some of these attacks that we're seeing, even in the ransomware context, it does not mean that even though everything remain within the environment, that it doesn't trigger a reporting obligation. Because everything's been encrypted. I'll give you an example. The proposed definition of a cybersecurity event under the proposed SEC regulations is an internal or external impact on integrity of systems or environments that could have a material impact on the business. So just integrity. So obviously, anything that manipulates or somehow changes that data environment could be an issue. And we're not seeing a lot of reporting going in assessment of that integrity issue when it comes to a cyber event. The second one is availability. So they do expect that there could be a material impact to the business if certain types of data is not available. Obviously, the classic example is the ransomware one, right, where everything gets locked up. But that's not the only measure of availability, is whether there's been impact in the complexity of the systems and environments where availability can be impacted in one way that could have a material effect. And it doesn't mean unavailability. It just means that the availability of itself has been compromised in some manner. And so we're not getting, my sense is that both the CFOs and the risk managers are not getting a sense from the business, for those that are conducting the investigation, how availability has been impacted such that they can assess materiality. And the second one is confidentiality. The third one is confidentiality. And that is, to what extent has any of the data in those environments have been accessed, taken, or anyway viewed such that the confidentiality gets implicated. Now, if you think about it from that context, we're talking about any impact on the compromised environment or data sets. And so understanding whether there's been exfiltration, understanding the impact of the environment, availability, the efficacy of the data that was there, all those are going to be really important things that have to now go up into the executive level or the officer level to assess what does that mean in terms of defining materiality of risk.
And I'll actually give you one very specific thing. Email, okay? First, every executive's email is the #1 target for most good cyber people. Why? It's chock full of stuff and no one ever cleans it up. And so first, limit the amount of email in your system. Think of this number. Every record you keep, okay, if it's exposed, if it's deemed to be notifiable, is going to cost you a minimum of $130. So the question is, why are you keeping records from 7 years ago? Are they generating $135 worth of revenue? Is there an increased value to it? Probably not. One of the biggest ways that you can lower cyber risk is identify data hoarding, which, by the way, tends to be in the financial and the legal departments because we hate to get rid of paper. Finding out ways to reduce the record size to properly encrypt is one of the easiest ways to really narrow down the impact of an event.
Can I add another one, Jonathan? Insufficient technical internal or external resources. We talked about how the market has changed in terms of the opportunity for bringing in internal resources. And so a lot of organizations are relying a lot more on those third-party providers. And I don't mean just the technology or solutions providers, but really folks that are going to help respond to incidents, conduct investigations, deploy some very specific tools that are necessary in order to assess the impact and containment and things like that. And so I do think that one of the things you're probably not getting really good visibility because it's such a changing environment is how do we deal with that availability of internal skills and resources that are necessary, and how, if those are not available internally because of the reasons we talked about earlier, is how do then that get supplemented with external resources? Also external resources, are we just getting the lowest cost value associated, or they really have that expertise available in order to support, particularly something that is a massive event? So I would just add those two.
Any other questions from the group? Well, folks, what I'd like to do is to turn it back over to David and Mauricio to give you any quick closing remarks that they have at this point.
No others on my end. Thanks, everyone, for your time, and would be happy to visit if any of you have specific questions.
Likewise, I would say that certainly you want to inform yourself as what is being proposed for reporting for next year. I believe that around April or May, we're going to start seeing some more definitive rules around here, and there's still a number of areas that I think are potentially problematic and uncertain. But sort of being abreast of it, understanding how that's evolved, because I do think that we're going to move from a post-breach reporting to a significant pre-breach type of reporting around cyber risk, and that's going to require, obviously, the involvement of everyone, particularly the CFOs who are signing off on those filings.
My last comment for all of you is, this isn't a technical issue. This is a risk issue. So part of the problem I see is that in many cases, the CISO does not speak the language of risk, or they don't quantify risk in terms of business and focus. So one area that you can be incredibly effective is just working through like a SWOT analysis with your CISO team around risk, helping quantify that, taking out the technology, the jargon, and focusing back on why do we have this? What is the business value it's providing? What is the risk? And is the risk justified under our values, our goals, and our structure? When a good risk analysis is applied, you get a lot more clarity around where and how to protect that particular business. And folks, thank you very much for your time. I know we're right before lunch, so David, Mauricio, I really appreciate coming out and the expertise and the time that you guys have provided, and I'll turn it back to Ryan and Patrick. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jonathan, David, and Mauricio. I don't know if I speak for everybody here, but I think I want to go back and revise my holiday card list and make sure that our CISO and our Chief Risk Officer are on it. So before everybody runs out and cleans up their inbox for the $130 for each email, which I am certainly very guilty on, I really want to thank all of the speakers today. I want to thank everybody who's joined us in person and everybody who's joined us virtually. I hope you found today as insightful as I have, and we really look forward to you joining tomorrow. We'll get started tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. For those of you who are joining virtually, our broadcast will conclude shortly.